Good evening, friends. This is the continuation of the secret world of magic dolls and imaginary friends, the Dolls of Cold Spring Village. This is chapter 2. Let's begin. A poem by Dorothy Shea. When enchanted doll fairies come out to play, a doll's fairy is hard to spot in the sun. When they see the light, they begin to run. They only come out when it's time to sleep. They hardly ever make a peep. When the shop is closed and they've all gone home, that's when the doll's fairies begin to roam. They enchant the bears and frogs and such. They dance all night and then they clutch. If you want to see your doll's fairy within, look for the glow beneath their chin. If you want to catch a fairy true, look for their eyes, a shade of blue. Smiling, laughing, and dancing home, they love to play when you're not at home. Grandma Min was coming to town soon, and I was surely looking forward to it. She was coming all the way from Mahopac to take Sally Ann and myself to the Marquee Cinema Picture Show after church on Sunday morning. I always thought of her as my best friend, and I missed her when I did not see her every week. She made me dolls and doilies, and she spoiled me rotten. For as long as I could remember, I loved her visits. She secretly gave me pennies and tiny handfuls of those 5-and-dime store red candies that came in the enormous jar behind Mr. Rudy's candy counter. Mr. Rudy owned the soda fountain shop next to the drugstore, and all the kids would get penny candies there every day after school. My grandmother would go to this store before coming to our house, and sometimes she would always save me a few extra red candies to hide in my pocket. These sugary sweets made my tongue all red and tasted sickly sweet for hours. I can recall getting in trouble at school when I made the mistake of spitting in the snow outside the classroom. Miss Cordelia, our teacher, thought that I had some horrible disease. She instinctively grabbed my shoulder and ran me to the town to see Dr. Jones right away. During this point in time, people took red spit in the snow very seriously. So I can recall the teacher did not have a very good sense of humor when she found out what had really happened. My mother was very angry as well, so it was about a year or two before Grandma Min tried to sneak me in another handful of those tasty red candies. After waiting all week, Sunday finally arrived, and off we went to church. Every Sunday, my mother dressed my sister and I up like two Puritan handmaidens from the north. These dresses had come from Nan's house in New Hampshire. Her grandmother had made them in the Dark Ages, and my family simply refused to throw them away. Most of the other children in town saw us walking to church on Sunday morning and would laugh at us for weeks at a time. We were the town joke, and everyone that witnessed us wearing these garments laughed at us feverishly. The gowns were like two old lady dresses, and they had long black empire waists with pure white frocks in front, and there was a full laced collar with a matching bonnet hat. Our dresses had plenty of tiny pearls up its spine, and when I leaned over while wearing this dress, I could hear the last bit of air forcefully deflate from my lungs. It had a long lace collar, which was always starchy and much too stiffly. The collar was so high, after looking through the holes and staring at the floor in church all morning, I had spots in my eyes. And the spot where it actually rested on my forehead left a little patterned tiny red dot that lasted on my forehead for hours. Sally Ann's dress was a smaller version of mine, but my grandmother had to remove all of the buttons on hers because she would rake it along the back of the walls at home. Sally Ann would have paint chips and frayed fabric, and then she pulled it until she could hang herself with them. After Sally Ann accidentally did hang herself in the bathroom on more than one occasion, the buttons came off, and Grandmother sewed safety snaps in the place of buttons. My friend Leslie often told me that my sister and I really resembled our old lady Delaney and her nasty sister. They lived at the top of the hill. My grandmother had often told us about the story of old lady Delaney and my grandfather's fighting over a wheelbarrow many years ago. The actual story was Mrs. Delaney was extremely angry with my grandfather for accidentally hitting one of her cats with a slingshot that came into his yard every day. The cat always tossed the dirt near his garden plants, so to get even with him, Mrs. Delaney walked up the driveway, stole his wheelbarrow right from his front porch, and then ran away with it. My grandfather then chased her up and down the hills, but she ended up wheeling the wheelbarrow right against Bowman's Creek. Since that day, my grandfather had a grudge against these disturbed women and told the neighborhood children scary stories about them, calling them the old crones of Cold Spring. The wicked Delaney sisters lived in the ancient, creepy farmhouse at the top of our hill. The building was the former Kennard Dairy Farm, and it did really look haunted. The decrepit farm stood mysteriously alone in the thick woods. The stance of the building gave the impression that it was slightly crooked. This was also the house that every kid in town was deathly afraid of due to its eerily dilapidated appearance. Most kids felt compelled to throw a rock and try to break the remaining glass windows that were left unbroken. But rumor had it that the sisters would wait on the darkened porch at night just to throw a rock back at the kids that walked by. One day, last May, one of the sisters got up from her creaky chair and threw a milk jug at a wandering pack of school children. They did manage to hit a boy right square between his eyes, so he took off bleeding and ran for home. Since that incident, no child would ever walk by that old house again for fear of being hit by a flying milk jug, rock, or some stray broomstick. Sunday morning at church wore on very slowly, and our little brown chapel was now growing warmer with the mid-morning sunlight. The pretty rays of light gently peeked through the stained glass windows of the colorful worship hall. I began to notice the church pew where we were all seated was thinning out by little, and the church organ began to play. The music rang out and the people rose to attention. Our fellow parishioners who were once standing in the pew with us were now creeping further and further away from us. Just then, I observed that same woman holding her child in the pew directly in front of us. She turned around and looked at my mother and me, and she made a nasty expression. And once she smelled my sister's fishy odor that lingered from the previous day, the woman swiftly took her child and forced herself into an already crowded pew near the pastor's podium. Giving my mother yet another dirty look, I instinctively glanced over at my mother, and I was able to catch a quick glimpse of her tongue fly in and out of her mouth. She had stuck her tongue out at the woman and was now sitting far away. The lady, her tongue, and the woman that had now sat far away scowled and looked quietly as my mother giggled to herself. I had never seen my mother do anything like that before. She was usually a dignified person. My mother had looked in my direction when she gave me a quick wink. She just calmly opened her hymnal and began to sing out loud. I giggled softly to myself, and I had witnessed my mother in her momentary jubilation. The organ music rang out through the halls, and my eyes were soon locked on the pastor in the front of the church. Redmond was a short man in stature, and he wore tiny round glasses on his face. When he laughed, his eyes squinted, and he made everyone laugh. Many times through the hour-long talk, he completely bald you so you could see the beads of sweat steadily streaming down the sides of his face. His cheeks were red and puffy. Pastor Redmond was a jovial character, but he actually mumbled his words instead of talking. I could never really understand whether he was saying, "Yes, my children, go with God," or "Oh my word, I've stepped on a frog." Either way, church for children was always an interesting adventure. Most grown-ups don't realize that kids are usually thinking of anything but what the man is saying behind that big wooden box. By the time I was 8, I had already counted every light on the ceiling over and over again. I had counted the pews and the number of bald men in front of us. I distinctly remember one time when my mom was ill and my dad had decided to take us to church on his own. He quietly sat behind us to make sure we were listening to the pastor. My father was so busy looking at what we were doing, he did not notice he had sat on the little boy's lollipop that was seated next to him. When he rose to receive communion, he had a giant rainbow pop stuck to his trousers, and everyone laughed as he walked by the seats. He was so mortified, he swore to never take us to church without my mother ever again. After today's church service was finished, my father and I walked to the train station in town. We could see my grandmother enthusiastically dancing and waving in the distance. Her train had just pulled in, and her arms held that usual red plaid carpet bag and the matching umbrella just in case it rained. And as soon as I saw the umbrella, I instinctively looked up to a bright blue sky and just had to chuckle. My grandmother was also kept a coin in her shoe for an emergency too. This was my mother's tradition as well. And I surely know when I get older, there will surely be a coin in my shoe too. My grandmother had the happiest smile on her face. She ran closer to me and gave me a big hug hello. Grandma Min took a hold of my hand as my father told her jokingly about Sally Ann and her little problem. So grandmother's usual understanding face just smiled again, and she simply said, "Oh well, we will just have to make the best of it." On our way to town, I turned to wave to my dad as he began to walk back up the hill toward home. He got smaller and smaller as we drew further away. "It's just you and I," my grandmother said to me, giving me several loud pretend kisses on my forehead. We could see the movie house in town. It was a large fancy gold building with many exciting big movie posters in the window. You were really unable to see into the cinema until you were actually inside it. This is where life outside seemed to stop and the entertainment seemed to happen as soon as you turned the corner. In the front of the cinema, the main candy booths were surrounded with many rows of brightly colored candy boxes that lined up in front of the ticket booth. At my eye level, I could see right through the glass countertop where the popcorn and candies were made, and it was an amazing sight to me. When the golden yellow popcorn came tumbling down the red chute that always landed perfectly into the gigantic white bathtub below, the man would scoop a large pile of popcorn into the red striped bags which were waiting on its side. The sight was surely a child's dream, but the scent of an even better experience. "It's almost time," my grandmother said, "so we had better get going." She pointed to the door and said entrance above it, and we quickly waded down the long hallway in the large seating area. There were only a few people in there, so we had the whole row to ourselves. After a few moments, the loud projector began a series of clicking sounds, and this was plenty of bumping and ruckus about. The only lights that remained were the backlights above our head in the projecting booth, where I could see the tall, thin man with a big cigar in his mouth. I had seen this man before in the movie theater alcove. The last time we went to the movies, he was collecting tickets and grumbling under his smoky breath. Today he was working upstairs and he was obviously having an equally bad day. His furry eyebrows connected, giving him cross expression on his face, and for some reason he held his cigar in his mouth even when it was not lit. I could see the man struggling with the film machine, and about 10 minutes in, he continuously was fighting with this projector. He vigorously stretched out all the film, growled to himself, and forcefully thrust it out the window next to him. He waved in anger. My grandmother had looked over at me. I could see her face illuminated with the lights from the movie. She had long red hair that glowed, and it made a halo around her sweet face. She held my hand and gave me a tight squeeze. We could hear the ongoing clicking sound that filmed the theater around us. Just then, my grandmother held my hand in front of the film. The shadow danced along the big screen for everyone to see. She used her other hand to imitate a duck while we were waiting in this big room. We both laughed out loud at the angry bald man that was still yelling out the window. And from where he was still standing, "Knock off the nonsense out there," he shouted to my grandmother with his unlit cigar falling out of his mouth. My grandmother suddenly stopped making the noises, but only after giving one more loud heckle in the dark room. My grandmother always had to have the final word, even in the darkened movie theater. That's the end of chapter 2, and turn in tomorrow for chapter 3.